I've made a lot of videos on Fullmetal Alchemist. That much is abundantly clear at this point. Still, there's somehow plenty I haven't talked about. In particular, large swaths of Ed's development, along with many of the themes and plot points surrounding his journey in the story, remain largely unexamined. So today, I want to end off this series by talking about Edward Elric, about his quest to get his and his brother's bodies back, and about the lessons he learns along the way. But of course, there are two distinct versions of Big Ed out there in the wild, the one present in mangahood and the one present in 2003. Needless to say, no Edwards are getting left behind on my watch, so we'll be talking about both of them at length. Without further ado, this is a comparison and character analysis of each version of Edward Elric. The Fullmetal Alchemist manga begins with 4 chapters that at first might seem somewhat unrelated to the story's wider plot. In each case, Ed and Al go up against a villain who either entirely disappears after these chapters or serves only a minor role moving forward. Meanwhile, most of the other characters present here won't appear again for many chapters, and when they do resurface, it'll be kept brief. Of course, there is a sense that something far more serious is going on behind the curtain, but even so, I think it's fair to say that these chapters come across as pretty episodic in nature. However, they all share something important. Ed and Al defeat the villain. Even if they can't find the Philosopher's Stone, they succeed on some level. Soon enough though, a new situation arises. A situation where Ed and Al don't have the knowledge necessary to succeed, where they can't fix what's broken, and where they can't take back what's lost. You probably know what I'm talking about. It's the infamous Nina incident. Here, despite hearing about Sho Tucker's previous chimera, Ed and Al don't have the slightest suspicion that he's a bad guy. Instead, they spend their time playing around with his daughter and dog until from one page to the next, the truth is revealed. Everything has gone wrong. Shortly after, they're killed by Scar too, and then it's even more clear. There's no fixing this. Just when they and the reader least expected it, Ed and Al have failed. This structure of strength followed by weakness, of knowledge followed by ignorance, it's powerful. It's stuck with me and it has impact every time I read the manga. Beyond that, it charts the story's course, showing us that regardless of Ed and Al's strengths, they will be challenged. They will need to learn. Because despite all of his competence and knowledge, there's still so much Ed doesn't know. At the end of the day, he's still just an ignorant alchemist. But this wasn't just a one-off event. No, after the Nina incident, the story maintains this change in direction. Time and time again, Ed and Al will encounter an opposition they simply can't stack up against. Needless to say, this means that now Ed and Al's weaknesses are on display instead of their strengths. This begins with hints of their past, with Ed's nightmare about their dead mother. It then continues when Scar destroys Ed's arm and nearly kills him, forcing Ed to return to Resin Bowl to get his automail repaired. Soon after, just when Ed and Al finally stumbled upon a clue that might help them find the Philosopher's Stone, the library housing key clues is burnt to the ground. An obstacle they only overcome thanks to Sheshka. After that, Ed and Al spend days cracking Marco's code, only to discover that the ingredients for a Philosopher's Stone are human lives. Later, when they go to Lab 5 to learn more about the stone's creation, Ed almost gets information, only to have his source killed right in front of his eyes. Then he only lives because the villains let him live, because they need him for some unknown purpose, and Al begins his descent into a multi-chapter identity crisis that will only be resolved because of Winry's intervention. Basically, throughout all these chapters, Ed and Al only survive and succeed because other people intervene and help them, or because there's some larger plan at play that they don't even begin to understand. The main messages here are clear. First, Ed and Al don't really know what's going on. There's something bigger than themselves in their quest that they haven't quite got a grip on yet. Second, they cannot complete their quest on their own. They cannot get their bodies back while relying entirely on their own strength. I mean, without Winry, Ed wouldn't even have 2 legs to stand on, or a second arm to perform alchemy. They need her now, and really, they've needed her from the beginning. And it's not just her they need other people too. Because in those moments when Ed and Al nearly give up, how do they keep moving forward? Where does their strength come from then? Well, it comes from people like Winry or Gracia or Hawkeye encouraging them. Without those people, they would be so much less likely to succeed in their quest. So just as Ed told Rose to stand on her own 2 legs and move forward, this network of supporters surrounding Ed and Al will tell them to do the same. Of course, this feeds into the story's focus on multiple perspectives being necessary to solve problems, on the importance of gaining knowledge from the wider world. After all, Amestris only survives due to the wealth of knowledge and the various perspectives that make the reverse national transmutation circle possible. Beyond that, there's Mustang's ideal of everyone looking after each other, and the concept of good actions creating ripples that extend outward. and make the flow of the world positive. The one needs the all, and Ed and Al are no different. Right off the bat, 2003 has a different way of framing Ed and Al's journey. It starts off similar enough though, with a version of the conflict with Father Cornello and Rose in Lior. However, from here, we jump back to the past. There, we see Ed and Al's failed human transmutation in detail, followed by their conflict with another alchemist who's trying to recreate his lover's soul using young girls' bodies. Then we get Ed and Al's battle on a train, but there are a couple changes here. For one, Hughes saves Ed's life, which makes Ed seem a little less competent in battle. Beyond that, it's revealed that Mustang knew this attack might happen, so he manipulated Ed and Al to get on the train so they could fight and hopefully bypass the state alchemist exam's usual age requirement. So, despite Ed and Al believing that they were charting their own course, it's revealed that Mustang has been guiding them even without them realizing it. In other words, they don't have as much control as they thought they did. Since this is one of Ed and Al's first experiences outside of Resin Bowl, it also gives the sense that this world is far more dangerous and unpredictable than they could have imagined. Really, it's hard to say if they're prepared for this. All this is to say that, despite sharing events with the manga, the reordering of those events and various alterations give us a vastly different understanding of Ed's character. We're focusing more on his childishness, as well as his struggle to become a state alchemist. Before Nina is even remotely involved, we're getting plenty of his weakness. Many other unique challenges also pop up in 2003. For example, in this version, Al is studying to be a state alchemist too, and he even manages to pass the written portion. However, due to a mandatory physical checkup, he's inevitably unable to become one. He's put in all the work, and yet he has so little to show for it. In response, Ed has this whole speech about how he's gonna stop wavering and how no matter what, he's going to return Al to the way he was. But things don't go quite as expected. First, Ed gaining his state alchemist certification isn't the big event he thought it would be. Instead, he's tossed his pocket watch and told, "Congrats, you're a dog in the military now." And that's that. Second, when he passes out after seeing a mother's mutilated body, he's reminded that he hasn't moved on from their failed human transmutation the way he thought they had. Third, he learns that the military is more corrupt than he ever imagined when Nina's transformed into a chimera and Boss Grand tries to take her away. So, after just saying he'd stopped wavering, what does Ed do? Well, he throws away his certification and abandons his position as a state alchemist, despite all the work he put into that. Why? Because in that moment, he can't stand simply doing as he's told. He wants to do something right now, something that can maybe, in some way, make up for his failure with Nina. As such, he decides to hunt down Barry the Chopper, but despite all his resolve, he nearly dies and is only saved because of Hughes' and Al's intervention. From here, he repeats himself. He breaks down and resolves once again to get his and Al's bodies back, no matter what it takes, and he regains his status as a state alchemist. It's clear now that 2003 is adding in many more challenges for Ed to overcome, and they're handled very differently from Mangahood's challenges. Don't get me wrong, Mangahood spends plenty of time focusing on Ed's weaknesses as well. However, it's mostly on a larger scale. In other words, Ed's position will be challenged, but then he'll make a resolution and stick to that resolution. Meanwhile, in 2003, Ed is in this constant cycle of choosing a path of action and stealing his resolve, only to have that decision thrown back in his face, to waver, or to receive a new piece of information that nullifies his prior decision. In this way, both Mangahood and 2003's events can be sorted into a series of resolutions made by Ed, or a series of beliefs he comes to hold, but Ed makes far fewer resolutions in Mangahood. Conversely, this means that he makes more resolutions in 2003. By extension then, between each of these resolutions, there's a significant period of wavering. To some, Ed's wavering in 2003 is frustrating. It makes him come across as flimsy and relatively weak-willed. But personally, I love both takes on his character, and for reasons I'll get into a bit more later, they fit perfectly with the overall message I think each series is trying to convey. However, the way I'm talking might give you the sense that Ed being challenged will always be a negative thing for him, but that's not quite true. In 2003's case, this is where the mining town comes in. See, at this point, Ed has accepted that he's going to be a dog in the military. He's accepted that he's going to put his and Al's goals above other people's well-being. It's easy to see why he feels that way. After all, he saw the corruption in the military with his own eyes, but now he's decided to remain as a part of that same organization. He's going against his principles, and he needs to contend with that fact. But things change when he goes to the mining town, because there he uses his intelligence and alchemic abilities to take this town from a corrupt government and return it to its people. This leads to others calling him an alchemist of the people, and to a young woman named Lyra choosing a better path, choosing to use her alchemy to help others instead of using it for the power of the government exclusively. So in this way, just after resolving to be more selfish, just after resolving to discard other people, Ed realizes that maybe things won't always be that simple. Maybe he can still act, at least on some level, as an alchemist for the people, even if he is working with the military. Using music, the show does a particularly wonderful job of selling this to the audience. After all, what piece of music is playing here? Well, it's the same one that played all the way back at the very start of the series, when Ed and Elle were about to perform their human transmutation, and it seemed like everything might go all right. There, of course, that piece of music was followed up by something very different, by a piece that was far more panic-inducing and immediately undercut the triumph of the previous music. Here, though, as Ed commits another taboo with his alchemy by transmuting gold in order to help the people in this town, that piece resolves and nothing else comes in to undercut this moment of triumph. At first blush, this may give the sense that Ed's struggles and failures are largely in the past, that from here he's going to succeed. But after a time skip, we see that isn't quite the case. In fact, a whole slew of new challenges await Ed, and he will need to change his position time and time again. For example, when they finally find Marco, Marco tells them that he has no interest in giving them the Philosopher's Stone, so Ed resolves to steal it. However, Boss Grand comes in and takes Marco away, and Ed makes another resolution. He won't let the government take Marco away. He won't see anything resembling a repeat of the Nina incident. However, he ends up breaking both of these resolutions. First, he gives the stone back to Marco, realizing that it would be wrong to take it from him and from this town's people. Second, after he learns about Ishval and the death of Winry's parents, he lets the government take Marco away. Afterward, Ed comes to believe that the Amestran soldiers who attacked Ishval are unequivocal monsters, and he yells at Alex, saying that he knows what they did there. However, after his conversation with the veteran who lost his leg, he learns that he doesn't really understand what happened with each individual soldier. As such, he apologizes to Alex for what he said. Ed's perspective only continues to be challenged from here. He believes that he and Al don't have a home to return to, only to have Winry shine a light from the window for them like their mother used to. He doesn't think Ross and Brosh will be of any help, but later Ross basically saves his life. He believes that the Philosopher's Stone will fix their problems, but it ends up being made up of human lives. He believes that letting Slicer live is the right thing to do, but Slicer challenges him, asking how he can justify letting a serial killer walk free, and then he watches as one of the Slicer brothers kills himself right before his eyes. He believes that Tucker is dead, but Tucker is really alive and in Lab 5. He believes that he and Al got to this lab of their own volition, but in reality, they were manipulated here by the homunculi, or at the least, fell right into their trap. Finally, in order to protect other people, Ed and Al lie, saying that they aren't trying to find the Philosopher's Stone anymore, but it's too late for that. Hughes is already too involved, and he's killed because of that fact. I could go on, but you get the point. 2003 spends a lot of time making Ed weaker by challenging him and having him fail. In this way, 2003 takes moments that manga had skirted past relatively quickly, and pulls a lot more tests and threats to Ed's worldview out of them. That's kinda to be expected though. After all, we've covered about half of 2003's episode count, but we've only covered about 15% of Mangahood. And Mangahood's just about to get to the meat of Ed's character, as he goes back to the past and encounters his teacher and the lessons he thought he'd learned so long ago. Move forward. Those were Ed's words to Rose and Lior. Ed and Al also promised each other that they would move forward and live, and it's what they've kept doing, regardless of all the obstacles in their way. Still, there's something they've been avoiding, something in their past they'd rather not dwell on. Of course, I'm talking about their failed human transmutation. In the manga, we've only gotten glimpses of it, but now it's time to finally go back. We're finally going to learn what they did. I love the manga structure here. Since we haven't covered this in any sort of detail till now, I think it communicates something key. Ed and Al have been avoiding this. They haven't wanted to return to their biggest mistake out of fear and shame. Now though? Now they confront that ignorance in their past of their own volition, and they go to learn from the teacher whose lessons they failed to comprehend all those years ago. Unfortunately, this is one area where I feel Brotherhood weakens Ed's characterization. After all, Brotherhood covers their botched human transmutation in episode 2, which takes away from the sense that they've been running away from their past, and that now they're going to face it. However, that's not all Brotherhood changed. We won't get to the mining town till much later, and it will only be a truncated version of those events, and as for the battle on the train, well, we aren't getting that at all. Instead, we get an anime original episode where some of Ed's strengths come into play, a flashback to their failed human transmutation, the stuff in the ore, and then the Nina incident. Which means the manga's structure of strength followed by weakness that I praise so much isn't as present in Brotherhood. Instead, Brotherhood focuses on their weaknesses right out of the gate, which in my opinion weakens their characterization during the Nina incident, its aftermath, and their return to their teacher. Regardless though, now Brotherhood and the manga are in pace with one another. Both versions of Ed are returning to their teacher, and they're going to experience very similar things from here. See, all the way back when Ed and El learned about alchemy from Izumi, Ed seemed to understand his small place in this world, the part he played as one within the all, and yet he and his brother still attempted to bring their mother back to life, so they grew conceited and ignored that lesson. The first example of Ed and El ignoring their teacher's lessons is obvious. I mean, it's hard to miss their human transmutation and the aftermath of that. However, this isn't the only way they failed to abide by Izumi's lessons, by the rule that one is all, and all is one. Because after losing their bodies, what did Ed do? Well, he agreed to become a state alchemist so he would have more resources at his disposal to help get his and El's bodies back. Now, I understand why he did this, and in some ways, it's admirable. After all, he just wanted to do anything he could to help his brother, and he pushed through a lot of pain and adversity to get there. However, the fact still remains that he chose to become a dog of the military to pursue his goals. At any point, it was possible he would have been ordered to become a human weapon. That being the case, wasn't he potentially putting himself and his goals above the good of the all here? Eventually, we also see the moment where Ed and El burn down their house. Why do they do this? Well, it's a symbol of their resolve. At least that's what they call it. But there's another way to view it. As an erasure, as an attempt to run away from their past. And later, when Hohenheim encounters Ed at Trish's grave, that's exactly what he calls it. Naturally, Ed hates hearing this from him, but he can't ignore the truth in his words. And he can't ignore it when Hohenheim asks Panako if what he and Al created was really their mother. When Ed hears that question, it gets him thinking, and then he can't stop thinking about it. Now there's a doubt, gnawing at the back of his mind. So he needs to face his past properly, no matter how painful that may be, by digging up the body he and Al created. And though doing it makes him feel sick, though his body itself compels him to stop, he pushes forward, which leads him to a new piece of knowledge. This wasn't his mother. This creature isn't human at all. This experience also helps Ed make an important connection. If the soul can't exist without the body, or if it at least can't be pulled back once the body's gone, then Al's body must still exist somewhere. Thus, rather than needing to make a new body or something like that, they may still be able to find his original body. And so, through this painful experience, Ed is able to turn a symbol of despair into a symbol of hope. In a way, Ed and Al saw the truth when they attempted to usurp the all due to their own ignorance. But they didn't see the truth behind the truth that there was yet more to learn from this mistake, if only they looked a little closer. This knowledge doesn't only help Ed and Al either. No, it also helps Izumi properly comprehend her trauma. Just as Ed and Al need others' help, Izumi will need theirs. Here, the story homes in on an incredibly important truth. Moving forward isn't all about pushing ahead and walking onward. Sometimes, in order to grow, it's necessary to look back, to return to the past you thought you could run away from. And sometimes, though looking back at the trauma in your past may feel like picking at a scab, it can be like putting medicine in a festering wound. Right away, 2003 takes this section of the story in a very different direction though. In fact, though a variety of shared plot points will still pop up, I think this is where 2003 truly cements its own direction. Because Ed and El don't choose to go and see Izumi like they do in Mangahood. Instead, Izumi tracks them down. While that's certainly a notable change, far bigger ones are on the way. See, much like in Mangahood, we get Ed and El's past training on this island. In 2003 though, Ed and El are brought back there by Izumi. So in the present, they're wandering around through the forest, and as they do that, we cleverly cut from past to present using similar objects and creative transitions. This way, we get a real sense that Ed and El are reflecting on their past, even if they are forced to do so. But something is wrong here. Someone is following them. At first, they don't take it too seriously though. It's probably just the guy who attacked them all those years ago on this island. But then everything changes when a young boy wanders out of the forest from behind them. Though they don't know immediately, they figure it out soon enough. This is a homunculus, a created human, and beyond that, he has Ed's arm and leg. The arm and leg that were supposed to have been taken in an equivalent exchange. And who created this homunculus? Izumi, their teacher who also attempted human transmutation. This way, Ed and El are forced to confront the human transmutation they thought they'd left in their past. All in all, what was a source of hope and inspiration in mangahood is instead used as one of Ed and Al's ultimate challenges, because now they know the origin of the homunculi in this version of the story, that they're the product of alchemists' failed human transmutations. But what will they do with that information? How will they move forward from here? Beyond all that, what are they going to do about Ed's arm and leg? As Alex asks them, are you planning to pluck them off the child? At first, that seems insane. Of course not. But if that is the case, they've reached an obstacle they can't overcome. A problem without a solution. Unless Ed and Al are willing to resort to violence, that is. In both versions of the story, so much of Ed's character moving forward is defined by this moment. By a painful return to the past that either fills him with hope for the future, or leaves him with more questions than answers. It's easy to see why. Once again, despite the fact that he's still flawed and has clear weaknesses, mangahood Ed manages to succeed on some level, while 2003 Ed is beaten into the ground after encountering a seemingly endless stream of failures or misunderstandings. And from here, the key differences between each series' themes will become clearer and clearer. After encountering his past in mangahood, Ed chooses to confront his ignorance time and time again. As such, he looks clearly at things he'd rather turn his eyes away from. In particular, after his encounter with Scar and Winry, he's swallowed by gluttony. Inside, he learns about the Ishval extermination, and about the role the homunculi played in it. Additionally, he uses Envy's Philosopher's Stone to perform human transmutation again and get out of this void. And that's when he sees Al's body within the portal. So now he has a simple way to get Al's body back. Open the portal again using a Philosopher's Stone and get him out of there. After all, even if they are made of humans, Envy assures him that these souls inside the stone are now just energy, and tells him to view this scientifically. The manga in particular focuses on Ed's desire to do just that, to use the Philosopher's Stone, view this as simple energy, and get Al fixed up already. That would be far easier than the alternative of thinking this through further. Considering Al's condition, they probably shouldn't be picky about their methods. However, he and Al also made a commitment to never let another person get hurt because of their quest. So if Ed chooses to believe Envy's words, well, at least in his own mind, he can abide by his own ideals, but only by remaining ignorant. Still, if he follows his suspicions that these souls are still human, if he looks deeper and tries to uncover the truth behind the truth, then that may result in a much harder path for him and his brother moving forward. Similarly, Ed also learns that Scar killed Winry's parents, protects Winry when Scar attacks, and stops her from shooting him. Naturally, after their previous encounters, Ed already didn't like Scar, but this brings so much more to the table. Scar didn't only try to kill Ed, he tried to hurt his childhood friend, and he already killed Winry's parents. Needless to say, Ed understandably hates Scar. And yet, after this encounter and after learning he could use the Philosopher's Stone to open the portal and get Al's body back, he follows up on his ignorance by asking Hawkeye what happened in Ishval. Meanwhile, Al talks with Dr. Knox about the same thing. With their combined information, they learn that many of the souls inside the Philosopher's Stone are those of the people killed in Ishval. Additionally, Ed gains a more sympathetic view of his enemy's life, and learns about some of the experiences that shaped him into what he is. Basically, he learns what human weapons have previously been ordered to do. Here, Ed has voluntarily learned more about the Philosopher's Stone's creation and about his enemy's past all at once. Even though it contradicts his worldview, even though it may make it harder for him to achieve his goals, he refuses to remain ignorant. And after this, he and Al agree that they won't use the Philosopher's Stone to get their bodies back. Instead, they'll look into alchemy, a different type of alchemy that could hold an answer for them, but could also just be a dead end. In this way, though, they continue to be true alchemists, as reflected in Mustang's master's words. Alchemists are creatures who must search for the truth as long as they live. When alchemists cease to think, they die. All in all, Ed has chosen the harder path. The path where he and Al refuse to take a life or have anyone else suffer while they journey to get their bodies back. And he has abided by that decision. At this point, it's hard to say whether he'll be rewarded for that, but one thing is clear. He is standing by his ideals, by the promises he and Al made to one another. Through this, the story continues to expand on its core lessons. Even if the truth is uncomfortable and undesirable, you can't run away from it. You need to look it directly in the eyes and try to comprehend it. Basically, living an honest life is more important than living an easy life. That's what mangahood has to say here. This is where 2003 comes in, because this version of Ed will not be following up on his doubts for some time. Instead, he's going to run away from the truth. At this point, we have to ask ourselves, what are Ed and Al's core beliefs in 2003? Well, they believe that equivalent exchange is the way of the world, and by extension, they believe that there's a larger truth that defines the world's rules. But there's a clear problem, because Wrath's existence brings all that into question. After all, he has Ed's arm and leg, but those were supposed to be taken in an equivalent exchange. Wrath even goes so far here as to question Ed's beliefs outright. And he isn't the only one who challenges Ed. No, Azumi does as well. She asks him if he believes in equivalent exchange, or as she calls it, a childish theory. She has evidence to back up her position too, questioning why exactly her child lost his life before he even had a chance to live. How on earth could that be called an equivalent exchange? How on earth could that be called fair? Ed isn't convinced by this, but that's not to say that he has an argument. At this point, he just believes it. Equivalent exchange is simply too foundational to his worldview. Regardless of its truth, he can't give it up. If he did, what would that mean for his journey with Al? What would that mean for his failed human transmutation? So, like in Mangahood, he pushes forward, but unlike in Mangahood, he does so without properly assessing his past. At the same time all this is going on though, Ed has to contend with the truth of the homunculi's creation. If he and Al made one, well, what do they do about that? But when he has his encounter with greed, he's going to be forced to confront that mistake in his past. At the same time, he'll also be forced to confront some of his deepest ideals and desires. However, Ed does manage to come to a conclusion before he even encounters greed. If homunculi are born because of the errors of alchemists, then alchemists just have to correct those errors. Now, Ed says that, but does he really have the strength to do it? To erase another being's existence? Maybe not, or at least that's what Greed thinks. So as Greed is weakened by other homunculis and Dante's attacks, he fights Ed without running and allows Ed to kill him. However, Ed doesn't understand that he's this weak, that he's this close to death. So, though he succeeded in doing what he said he'd do, he breaks down, screaming, after encountering the true terror of erasing these so-called errors. In this manner, Greed challenges Ed's determination and gives him the heart to do the same thing in the future again. But that isn't the only way Greed challenges Ed's position. Because really, what has Greed done here? Well, he's entrusted his vengeance to Ed, and given up his own life to teach him. Basically, Greed, after being beaten down and imprisoned for so long, has trusted Ed with the knowledge necessary to kill the other homunculi, and sacrificed himself in that process. Additionally, Greed has been spending his time with other outsiders, with chimeras and people discarded by society. All in all, his motivations and actions and emotions, they're complex and varied. Before, Wrath simply being a child served to challenge Ed's beliefs, but Ed still saw Wrath attempt to kill his teacher. So he had a reason to fight him, an experience he could look back on to help him keep this belief that Wrath and the other homunculi are fundamentally different from him. But now, with Greed? Not so much. All this is to say that Greed has simultaneously given Ed the will to kill the homunculi and made that mission more complex. Now, killing a homunculus doesn't seem all that different from killing another human, does it? And this is far from the end of 2003 exploring the homunculi's humanity. In the very next episode, we get an exploration of Lust's personality as she struggles with her own conception of what exactly being human means. Of course, she does terrible things in this episode, but she's clearly conflicted. She's clearly uncertain about what she should do, and as she asks existential questions about herself and those around her, it becomes clear that she's far more complex than Ed or Al previously imagined. At first, focusing on Lust's past at this point might seem relatively random. After all, it's not exactly related to Ed and Al's quest, to their current goal of hunting down Scar. But that's not quite the case, because this still serves to challenge Ed. He may not have seen this side of Lust yet, but we have, so we know that Ed's challenge is about to grow much more difficult. Greed wasn't the only homunculi with humanity and complexity. Lust has it too, and if she does, what about the others? And if that is the case, if the other homunculi are similar, how is Ed going to rationalize violence against them in the future? In other words, if the binary between human and homunculus gets broken down enough, will Ed be able to follow through and kill them? From here, both Mangahood and 2003 are going to challenge Ed's ideals related to violence. Specifically, his belief that he shouldn't kill. In Mangahood, this challenge comes in the form of Briggs. Though Mangahood's version of Central is by no means sunshine and rainbows, Briggs is an entirely different beast. Due to the border conflict with Drachma, this is an environment where violence is far more normalized and even necessary to protect the country. Naturally, this kind of place stands in stark contrast to Edenal's own beliefs and worldview. After all, would they truly ask that the soldiers of Briggs lay down their weapons and allow Drachma to march right on through? Well, no, they don't, but that doesn't mean that they abandon their ideals. Instead, we expand on what exactly their beliefs are. Overall, it seems that, rather than viewing murder as always wrong, as something that can always be avoided, they simply want to avoid it themselves, and they do not want to kill someone if there is any other way to deal with the situation. In the end, they're rewarded for standing by their ideals. Specifically, their decision to spare 4 Chimera soldiers who are working against them pays off in spades when they become close allies. In this case, if the Briggs soldiers had simply ignored them and murdered the Chimeras like they wanted to, they would have lost valuable fighters. Additionally, Ed takes the knowledge he's gained from Hawkeye to have a real conversation with Miles about the aftermath of the Ishval War. As such, Ed is able to look Miles right in the eyes and face some of Amestris's disturbing past, even if that past makes him uncomfortable. None of this is to say that everything about Briggs serves to challenge Ed and Al. In fact, some elements of Briggs reinforce this ever-important idea of one is all and all is one. Particularly Olivier Armstrong, who at first seems like she would lash out in violence at the slightest provocation, ends up embodying this idea incredibly well. After all, when Miles went to her to ask why she would allow an Ishvalan to continue serving in the military, she answered without hesitation. Race, ethnicity, gender, class. Any type of prejudice on the battlefield can only lead to weakness and an increase in casualties. It appears to me that it's because of your blood that you view this world from a unique perspective. So, where others may see division, she sees an opportunity for greater knowledge. Basically, she sees that the all must be made up of varied perspectives in order to serve as an effective one. This is her conception of Briggs' survival of the fittest. It's not just about the strength of the individual, it's about the strength of the group. And that strength of the group comes up again when Scar's brother's notes, Scar's language, May's alchemy, Marco's research, and Al's intuition allow them to piece together the reverse national transmutation circle and learn how to combat Father. Without the wealth of knowledge that comes from a diverse all, they never would have been able to comprehend this. Kimberly, the main antagonist in this section of the story, stands in stark contrast to Olivier, Ed, and Al's worldview. Much like many of the people in Briggs, he views the world in terms of survival of the fittest, but his conception of that is very different, because he focuses on the individual. After all, he has no qualms leaving others behind if they no longer serve a purpose to him in that exact moment. In addition, he has a simple conception of responsibility. To him, each person has their own individual role within the all, and their worth is measured based on how they complete that one task. So his role may be as a human weapon, but he also respects the likes of the Rockbells, who stand firmly in their conviction that as doctors, they should be saving all lives. However, even though he can see their worth, he still views his individual role as more important. If ordered to, he will kill them without hesitation. Only the strongest individual in the strongest role will survive. Everyone else can be discarded and destroyed. In the end, though, this mentality is a big part of what leads to his downfall. See, Kimberly may have defeated Ed when they fought, but he also abandoned his subordinates, which gave Ed an opportunity to abide by his own ideals and save their lives. And later, it's none other than one of these men he abandoned, none other than one of these people that Ed saved, who deals Kimberly a finishing blow. His narrow conception of survival of the fittest, his belief in purely individual power, is what leads to his body being consumed by pride. This section makes something abundantly clear. Ed, Al, and Olivier's ideals are correct. That is, their ideals that the strength of the all is most important, and that being made up of varied perspectives will only benefit that all. Beyond that, Ed and Al's conviction to not kill definitely has its place. I mean, just without these 4 chimeras, there are multiple moments where things would have gone very differently, where lacking their aid would have left them in a far worse scenario and cost many lives. Meanwhile, in 2003, Ed has gone in a very different direction. Where mangahood Ed continues to stand by his idea to never kill, 2003 Ed has just killed greed, and goes into the next episode saying that killing people is easy when he talks about Scar. This event has changed him, and it seems like there's no easy way back. Now, that's not to say that Ed holds strong to this position or that he's going to become a murder machine. Instead, through this episode, Ed expands his worldview by interacting with Rick, Rio, and other Ishvalans. He and Al learn about prejudice within the Ishvalans themselves, and come to understand that the world can't be split quite as cleanly into aggressors and victims as they previously thought. After all, though the military personnel previously carried out horrible crimes against Ishval, here they're the ones protecting an Ishvalan from other Ishvalans who would like to kill him due to his failure to adhere to their religious beliefs. This old Ishvalan man also challenges Ed's beliefs that Ishvalans couldn't understand alchemy when he reveals that the grand art is a whole lot like Ed's alchemy. Here, Ed is beginning to see the Ishvalans more as proper people who are on equal footing with him and Al. Then, after Ed also admits to Rick and Rio that he's sometimes a bit scared of the difference between them, he vows that he won't kill anyone, including Scar, and that he won't let Scar kill anyone else either. Of course, it's hard to tell if this includes the homunculi, if Ed considers them human enough, and Ed goes on to avoid talking about them, as though he's running away from the fact that he'll need to fight them at some point or another. There are other ways the story expands on this concept of violence here too. In particular, Winry learns that Mustang killed her parents in this version of events. Though this isn't exactly a challenge for Ed at this point, it is used to make the world of 2003 more morally complex. After all, Winry wants to hate him now, but can she call him a bad person through and through? Wasn't he best friends with Hughes, someone she looked up to and saw as somewhat of a father figure? 2003 only makes this trickier when it flips over to Mustang and his friends to give them the funniest episode in the series. At first, this might seem like something akin to filler or a side story, but I don't think that's the case. Instead, it serves to show us a different side of Mustang, a fun side that stands in stark contrast to Winry's own struggles related to him at this point in the story. Overall, it reinforces Winry's belief that, despite being a murderer who killed her parents, he isn't only a bad person defined exclusively by this event. Either way though, Ed and Al still both believe that they shouldn't kill anyone, and they believe that they will stand by that. Right now, this might not seem all that different from Mangahood, but just like in Mangahood, we're about to meet someone who will challenge their conviction. Of course, it's Kimbley. But this version of Kimbley is different from Mangahood's. There he talked more about the idea of being the last one left standing, how the world is about survival of the fittest, and about how everyone has their role to play. In other words, he believed the world does and should operate a certain way. 2003's version of Kimbley doesn't quite have that depth to him. Instead, he's a simple killing machine who thinks all humans are hollow. So he's rejected the concept of meaning and decided to live only by his own desire for violence. Needless to say, leaving someone like that alive, well, it might not be the best idea, especially when that person is given military power. Even so, Al doesn't understand the type of person Kimbley is, and in his naivete, stops Martel from killing him. In the end, letting Kimbley live results in this moment, where Kimbley turns Al into a ticking time bomb and blows apart Scar's body. Ed and Al's previously discussed ideals have been carried out. They haven't killed another person. But at what cost? At first, Al's actions here might seem unbelievably frustrating and stupid. But really, is it all that different from when Ed and Al let these guys live in Mangahood? Of course, those chimeras were a whole lot nicer, but Al didn't know that for certain, just like how he doesn't know how Kimbley is for certain here. In this way, the type of mercy that was used to show the validity of Ed and Al's ideals in Mangahood is used here to show their ignorance and how those ideals can be weak. But that isn't the only way 2003 challenges Ed and Al. No, there's something else from a long time ago that's about to come back in both versions of the story. A place they saved all that time ago, with a girl who Ed told to stand up on her own two legs and move forward. In my opinion, the return to Lior is one of the most powerful examples of the thematic differences between these series. See, in Mangahood, Al eventually makes his way back to Lior. There, Al interacts with Rose and sees that, despite the fact that Lior is by no means a paradise, the people here have banded together. They're basically following Ed's words and advice, working as a unit with their own power to build their home back up from its dilapidated state. It's a moment that, once again, shows the strength of Ed and Al's ideals. Their positive actions at the beginning of the series have rippled outward, creating a positive flow that helps everyone in Lior. However, 2003 uses the return to Lior for the opposite purpose. Instead of showing the benefits of Ed and Al's previous actions, it's used once again to show their weakness. See, all the way back in episode 13, Mustang decided to keep a secret from Ed and Al. Things weren't going well in Lior, despite the good they tried to do there. For whatever reason, the military had swooped in and only made things worse. But now Ed is forced to face the truth when he returns. Ed and Al left Lior in the hands of its people, had shown that Father Cornello was a fraud, and had told Rose to stand up on her own 2 feet. So pretty similar to Mangahood. But from there, some of the people turned to another false prophet, to a different version of Cornello. Then people started fighting, then the military came in and made things worse, and then after all that conflict, this was all that was left. Graves. An incredible number of people who were killed, regardless of Ed and Al's previous intervention. On top of that, Rose has been abused by military personnel, including a man who Ed helped save all the way back in the 5th episode. And she's been left mute from the trauma. And she's being used as a holy mother to manipulate the masses. Without a doubt, Ed and Al have failed here. And as Ed sees all this, as he comes to terms with everything that has happened, with the hell that his actions couldn't account for, he has more and more trouble telling Scar to stop with his plan to make a Philosopher's Stone using soldiers' souls. Maybe, just maybe, a person standing up on their own 2 feet wouldn't be enough to avoid this destruction and tragedy. Maybe they were hopeless to do anything to stop it. Even so, he still says he's against killing people in the military to make the stone. But after seeing all this, there's nowhere near the same confidence from him. After all, would he really tell Scar to just stand aside and let it happen? To allow the military to do whatever they want and not fight back? As we've seen in previous scenes and as we're seeing here, the path of pacifism isn't exactly working out for Ishvalans. There simply doesn't seem to be an easy way to stop their suffering. In the end though, Ed plans to exchange Scar as a way to stop the military from entering Lior. But once again, he fails, and it's only because of that failure that he and Al even end up in possession of the Philosopher's Stone, and it's only because of Scar that happens too. Yet another case of Ed and Al trying to move forward with their own power, but it just not turning out that way at all. Now, I don't think either of these versions of the story are inherently better than one another or anything like that. Comparing them simply reveals some big thematic differences between them. In Mangahood, at this point, Ed and Al become guiding lights of sort, leaving positive ripples with each of their steps that extend outward and become more positive ripples that in turn create a positive flow. So Mangahood reinforces its lesson that any action, no matter how seemingly small or futile, can still make the world a better place. Meanwhile, 2003 is highlighting its lesson that sometimes one good action simply isn't enough in the face of incredible power and systemic abuse. Some people simply don't get to have control over their own lives, no matter how unfair and sad that may be. Either way though, both Mangahood and 2003 are moving towards their end, and it's in that end that we will find the meaning of Ed's character development in this series and the ultimate lessons they're trying to convey. By this time in Mangahood, Ed and Al's goals have shifted dramatically. Before, they'd gone to Briggs to find May and learn more about alchemy, but now they've learned about Father's National Transmutation Circle and are working to oppose him. At least for the time being, their individual quest has been cast to the side because they've got this to deal with. So once again, Ed and Al are abiding by their ideals. They said they wouldn't let anyone get hurt in their quest, and part of that includes not ignoring stuff like this in favor of continuing that quest. In other words, they see helping the all as part of their duty, and they will fight for that all, even if it means that Al is in increased danger of having his soul ripped from his armor. Of course, this change presents new challenges for Ed and Al. In particular, Ed previously wouldn't make a deal with Greed because Greed kidnapped Al, so he didn't want to work with him to get his and Al's bodies back. Now though, after this Greed has taken over his friend's body, well, he agrees to join forces with him because this is no longer just about him and Al. This is about having as much strength as possible in their upcoming fight with Father. In a similar manner, Ed joins forces with Scar at multiple points, regardless of his understandable disdain for him. Basically, Ed understands that he must put aside his grudges and anger, that he must set aside his pride and humble himself in order to properly protect the world. Similarly, Al needs to use the Philosopher's Stone in his fight with Pride and Kimberly, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes him. But there's something important to remember here. He's not using it for himself. He's using it for the world. From here, Ed takes all the knowledge he's accumulated throughout his journey, and he becomes a guiding light for many characters. As such, he helps Mustang when Mustang almost loses control of himself, reminding him of his duty to lead the country with clear eyes, to put the good of his people above his own desires. But I believe Ed's interactions with these homunculi are even more instrumental in understanding this side of him. Because here, he has ideological conflicts with each of them, and through talking, manages to expose some weakness or contradiction in their perspectives. Let's start with envy. Despite being made up of human souls, envy hates them and enjoys making them suffer. That's pretty clear. Here's the weird thing though. If envy hates humans so much, why choose to look like one the majority of the time? Well, as Ed faces envy and looks at their tiny insect-like form, he gives his answer to that question. Envy isn't being honest with theirself. Envy doesn't just view humans as beneath them. Envy is jealous of them. And after Ed points this out to them, after Ed shows them compassion, after seeing that they were wrong about humans, envy can no longer stand living, and Ed wins simply by seeing the truth. Similarly, there's Greed, who talked about wanting everything for himself. However, when Ed joins him, when Ed gives him a new group to call his own, he helps him realize the truth about himself. He just wanted friends. And so Greed fights for those friends and helps them defeat Father, even going so far as to sacrifice himself in service of a greater good. However, I think Ed's final confrontation with Pride is even more telling. Here, Ed questions Pride's actions, and he asks Pride how he can keep just following Father's orders blindly, when Father doesn't even show concern for Pride when his body is nearly broken. I mean, Father, with his body like a Philosopher's Stone full of power, doesn't even pause to heal Pride before running away from his assailants. In this moment, though, Ed is applying his human sensibilities to a homunculus, even though Pride tells him not to. And then Ed has the opportunity to kill Pride. But this is another case where his ideals come into play, because he had vowed to never kill another person. But one of the homunculi? Well, that could be fair game. And yet it isn't, because when he reaches inside Pride's crumbling body, he calls his name, but not the name Father gave him. Instead, it's his human name, Salim, and in that moment he recognizes Salim as a human worth saving and protecting, a human that he cannot kill because of the promise he made and because of his beliefs and convictions. In this way, he turns away from what other people might think, that erasing a homunculi wouldn't exactly be killing, and decides to live by his own truth. Throughout all these interactions, Ed creates positive change in the world by breaking down the divide between human and homunculus, by having compassion for them no matter how bad they might be, by putting aside this idea that the world can be sorted neatly into good and bad, by accepting that giving them a chance is worth it. So through all this, Ed has become a beacon of hope for the other characters, and Al has followed suit. They've become powerful idealists who enact change around them by using their knowledge and experience to better the world. This way, the story continues to show the strength of their ideals and the importance of living in the truth while also living for a bigger purpose. And then there's 2003. Once again, 2003 stands in stark contrast to mangahood. First, Ed and Al definitely aren't on the same page in this version of the story, and there are a number of reasons for that. Mainly, Ed and Al have the Philosopher's Stone now, but it's not quite what they expected. Because Al himself is now the stone, meaning that he and Ed can't necessarily use it while keeping Al safe. After all, what will happen to Al's body if they use the stone's power? Well, Ed definitely doesn't want to risk anything, so he's not going to use it. But another reason for Ed's hesitance is hinted at too. Ed may not be comfortable using the Philosopher's Stone because it's made up of so many human lives. Either way though, Al previously questioned Ed, asking what they were going to do about the homunculus they made. But now they've swapped positions. Al is focused on getting Ed his body back, while Ed has his sights set on the homunculi, on cleaning up the mess he and his brother made, all the way back at the beginning of the series. However, Ed's confrontations with the homunculi take on a completely different meaning in 2003. First off, Ed returns to his mother's grave to collect her remains, so that he'll have the pieces of her necessary to kill Sloth. Where Manga Hood's Ed found hope by digging up a body from the past, this Ed finds pain and sorrow and yet another moral dilemma. After all, we've already seen more of the homunculi's human side. They aren't entirely evil. They have at least some potential for good. So, in that case, is killing them really the right thing to do? This only gets more complex when Lust, who previously let them escape from Lior, joins forces with Ed to seal the other homunculi, so long as Ed promises to make her human. Then there's Wrath, who's now experiencing massive panic and anxiety attacks when confronted with his trauma inside the gate. Through seeing this, we're reminded that he's just a child who, regardless of all his problems and mistakes, simply wants to be with his mother and feel safe. Considering that, would killing him really be different from killing any other child? Still, Ed insists that he's facing his own sin by fighting Sloth, and it's here that it's important to consider the name of that sin: Sloth. But why Sloth? Wouldn't pride be more accurate? How was laziness involved in he and Al attempting to bring their mother back? But here's the thing. Sloth isn't only about laziness. In fact, the 7 deadly sins were originally the 8 deadly sins, and they included Acedia and Tristitia, which were later combined to make Sloth as we know it now. Tristitia can be translated as depression, sorrow, or grief, while Acedia is a listlessness, apathy, or lack of care. More specifically, it can be seen as ignoring something you ought to do. That being the case, Sloth is quite a fitting word for Ed and Al's weaknesses. They gave into their grief after losing their mother, which led them to attempt human transmutation. Then Ed attempted to run away from the fact that he needed to somehow take care of the homunculus he'd created. Beyond that, the word Acedia is apparently the negative form of a Greek term that relates to respect for the dead, so if that is the case, then Ed and Al's failure to respect the dead is obviously tied up in them attempting to bring their mother back to life, and I'm about to waste a whole afternoon on Wikipedia, aren't I? Now, regardless of my all-nighter spent on Wikipedia, there's the question of how Ed and Al will deal with Sloth. At first, Al is staunchly opposed to hurting her. He sees their mother within her. But then Sloth tries to hurt him and Ed, and he finds the will to fight back. Even as they're fighting though, Sloth talks about her own struggles, about how she has memories that shouldn't be hers, and about how killing Ed and Al is just her way of trying to prove to herself that she's her own person. She's having an identity crisis, and despite her appearance, she's little more than a child raised by Dante, who simply doesn't know her place in the world. Either way though, Ed and Al kill her, but not before she tells them, "Good work. Make sure you tidy up when you're finished." So there's a pretty obvious question at this point. Have Ed and Al made the right decision? Was killing her the right thing to do? Well, that's unclear. It really doesn't seem like there was a right decision. The morals of this story have become increasingly messy, and we're at a point where the distinction between right and wrong only grows blurrier. In this way, through his interactions with the homunculi, 2003 continues to explore Ed's weaknesses where Manga Hood chose to explore Ed's strengths. Basically, we're looking at one story where there is a right way for Ed and Al to act, and they are rewarded for that, and we're looking at another story where there isn't necessarily a right way to act, and it's hard to tell if they would be rewarded for doing the right thing anyway. Of course, there are still other antagonists to talk about though: Father and Dante. First, let's talk about Father. In my opinion, there's one question that's absolutely central to Father's character. What did he want? Well, in the beginning, he wanted to escape from his flask. After that, though, he wanted to consume God, to consume the all into his one, and to have all the knowledge in the universe. He wanted to subsume and understand everything, to have no limits or boundaries applied to him. But in the end, he faces the truth, and the truth tells him what he did wrong. He never believed in himself. At first, that might seem like some hollow platitude, but consider Father's actions. He excises his own personality from his body, he consumes humans, and he believes he can only be free if he subsumes God. In all cases, he looks outside of himself in order to gain freedom. So yes, he tries to consume the all into his one, but he never looks inside himself to properly assess his position within that all. He also never looks inside the all to gain knowledge from them. In fact, he refuses to hear their words and views them as nothing more than ants. All at once, he rejects his own power by relying entirely on consuming others, but he also rejects others' strength by refusing to learn from them. As such, he never believes in himself in the sense that he was never able to accurately view his own possible shortcomings, or to create an identity for himself, or to find something worth living for that he enjoys. Instead, he always needed something more, and was left constantly chasing this thing outside of himself, even though he couldn't give that thing a name or understand it. And in contrast to this, we have Ed. Ed who, at first, attempted to break free from the constraints of human knowledge to bring his mother back to life. Ed who, throughout his journey, has faced his weakness. Ed who has confronted his ignorance time and time again. Ed who still hasn't stopped pursuing the truth. And Ed who is finally able to accept and understand the true meaning of one is all, and all is one. This way, Ed and Father's journeys seem like opposites, and Ed's final confrontation with the truth only makes that clearer. Because at the end, after Al sacrifices himself so Ed can beat Father, Ed uses all the knowledge he's acquired throughout their journey, and he performs one last human transmutation. And here he realizes that he had a way to get Al back all along. The gateway. His gateway. And it's his humility in this moment that allows him to understand that it's okay to live without alchemy, that he was never anything other than an ordinary human anyway, and that there are plenty of different ways to find a meaning and a purpose in his life. At first, it might seem like it would be easy to say that Ed and Al's journey was useless, at least as far as getting their bodies back was concerned. However, that would be ignoring the fact that it was this journey that allowed Ed to grow enough to reach this moment, to have this epiphany, and to regain some of what he lost. Because he refused to ever stop looking deeper, to ever stop thinking harder. He has discovered yet another truth behind the truth. But Ed and Al's journey isn't over yet. No, they choose to travel around the world in an attempt to gain knowledge that can help the all. This way, just as Ed refused to accept the status quo when he saved Salim, he will continue to challenge what is seen as common knowledge in the pursuit of a better world. So, Ed may have lost his ability to use alchemy, but through continually confronting his own ignorance, he's able to remain a true alchemist all the same. The core lesson to learn from Mangahood's Ed is fairly simple, but still powerful. Face your ignorance with humility and a willingness to learn. Doing that is no easy task, but it is a worthwhile task. That way, others will help you and you will help others, and they in turn will help more people. The flow of the world will become more positive. One is all, and all is one. Toward the end of 2003, there's this scene where Ed and Mustang talk for what seems like the last time. And it's here that they discuss their individual decisions to face the homunculi. So in a way that's not all that different from Mangahood, Ed says that there's no such thing as a war we don't have anything to do with, and then it won't help anything if it's just their dreams that come true. Above all else, this is Ed accepting his responsibility to help the world, to serve the all. By now, he doesn't even seem to care about getting his own body back. He's too busy trying to clean up the homunculi. Before, he and Al thought their mistake was made, that they'd paid their price, and that they could regain what they'd lost. In all cases, it was about them. But now they know that their actions had a much wider impact, that their actions paved the way for the creation of a new Philosopher's Stone before they even began searching for it, and that their search for the Philosopher's Stone was spurred on by Dante from its outset. This isn't just about revenge for Hughes or themselves. This is about stopping anything like this from ever happening again. So Ed's sense of responsibility compels him to erase all traces of the stone, so that nothing like this tragedy in Lior can ever happen again. Mustang responds in kind, saying that he can no longer close his eyes and attempt to ignore the evil all around him in pursuit of his own goals. Overall, based on this conversation, it seems like 2003, despite all its deviations, is coming back around to a somewhat similar ending to Mangahood. Ed will put the good of the world above his and his brother's own quest, and he will fight toward that end. But there's one topic Ed has been avoiding, a truth he's been unwilling to face. What if equivalent exchange is a lie? See, even though Azumi and Wrath questioned the validity of equivalent exchange, Ed has ignored that and kept believing that it's true. I mean, just recently, he sought to offer Scar to the military as an equivalent exchange for Lior's freedom. And that isn't the only way his conception of equivalent exchange has failed him and his brother. Previously, Dante blathered on about it to Ed and Al in an effort to keep them hunting for the Philosopher's Stone, telling them that people only gain one thing for one effort. Of course, regardless of all their efforts, their quest didn't turn out as they'd hoped. Then later, Tucker says he'll teach Al how to use the Philosopher's Stone if he's allowed to use it first, and he calls that an equivalent exchange. Really, if anything, it seems like Ed and Al's belief in this often only serves to make them easier to manipulate. In the end though, during this final confrontation, Dante tells Ed what she really thinks about equivalent exchange. She says that it doesn't exist, and beyond that it's an excuse used by the weak. Basically, she likens it to the just world fallacy, where people convince themselves that the world is fair and ignore the unfair suffering all around them because facing that truth, well, sometimes it's simply too much to handle. However, even when facing Dante, this person who wears Lyra's skin, the same Lyra who Ed inspired all the way back when he saved the mining town, and the same one who vowed to do better and work towards that end, Ed still won't accept this. It's simply too ingrained into his view of the world, regardless of all the things that contradict his belief in it. However, Ed is forced to confront his ignorance further when he goes through the gate and learns the so-called truth. Which, of course, is that there is no truth. At least not the way he thought there was. Instead, there's simply another world, and alchemy is powered by the lives lost there. So Ed's ideals and beliefs are challenged this way too. After all, he didn't want to kill, yet he's been using abilities only granted to him because of death on the other side. Here, Hohenheim also talks with Ed about equivalent exchange, and says that he's relieved that it doesn't exist. And then, after already killing Sloth, Ed learns that another homunculus is related to him. Envy. Envy was his brother. For so long, he's tried to view them as fundamentally different from himself, but this moment only makes that more difficult to believe. All in all, the foundational elements of Ed's world and experiences are cracking. He's cracking. And a series that has constantly been about pushing Ed, about challenging his beliefs, goes for the very core of his character. Which is exactly why I love the way the 2003 TV series ends. Sure, to the audience, this otherworld twist almost comes out of nowhere. Really, the only big hints of it come from these flashes of images when Ed sees inside the gate. But that's the thing. This is just as random for Ed, just as crazy and unexpected. And for a character who tried so hard to understand the world using laws and rules, what could be a greater challenge than having the actual source of alchemy be something that he never could have guessed? And after all that, Ed performs another human transmutation in a desperate attempt to keep his brother alive. So regardless of all he's been through, regardless of all his efforts, he simply ends up doing human transmutation again. And despite it working, he ends up on the other side of the gate, separated from his brother, who's also lost his memories of their journey together. Even though they promised they'd be with one another at the end of this journey, they've failed. Ed has failed. He hasn't gotten what he wanted at all. All in all, this might seem like a completely hopeless end, like an end without meaning, but I don't think that's the case. Sure, a whole lot of things went wrong, but does that mean it was truly all for nothing? No, I don't think so. After all, Ed and Al's actions played a major role in Dante's defeat, and stopping a repeat of a tragedy surrounding the Philosopher's Stone. Much like in Mangahood, Ed also performs human transmutation to save his brother. So yeah, Ed wasn't able to embody an ideal, he wasn't able to get the happiest end, but he never would have succeeded at all if he hadn't tried. The message here to me is that even if you can't understand how the world works, even if there might not be a neat way of tying everything together that you can comprehend, that doesn't mean that you should just give up. It's still worth trying to do the right thing, to be better, to do what you can. This is where the Conqueror of Shambhala comes in. Even though I have problems with that movie, I do like what it does for Ed's character. Because there, Ed's ignorance is even more pronounced. He's in a whole other world, full of familiar faces, yet still so different from his own. He even starts seeing this as a sort of dream, as a place that maybe just exists in his own mind. Eventually, though, Ed and Al agree that they can't view themselves as separate from the world. Just as they had to admit that their creation of a homunculus impacted others, they have to accept their responsibility to the world at large. They can't simply focus on their own dreams and let the rest of the world pass them by like they're totally unrelated to it, because they're a part of the world they're in. They impact that world, and that world impacts them. At one point, it seemed like Ed wanted to discard other people to ignore what they needed so that he and Al could pursue their goals. But now Ed is just the opposite. He puts the world before himself. He's grown that much. And in the end, Ed and Al both go to the other side of the gate in order to do what they can to keep these worlds separated and to stop some sort of terrifying war between these worlds from ever happening again. They finally understood their small part within the greater flow of the universe. They finally understood what it means to be a part of the world. And they finally understood the meaning of one is all, and all is one. Well, folks, that's it. After 4 years of working on it, that's the end of my series comparing 2003, Brotherhood, and the manga. More than anything else, though, every time I've gone through this series again, every time I've written another script about Fullmetal Alchemist or thought about it more, I've only grown to appreciate every version of this series on a deeper level. It's one of my favorite series, and regardless of all the time I spent watching it for these videos, I know I'm going to be rewatching and rereading every version of this again. Overall, though, just thank you to everyone who watched all these videos. I also hope you'll stick around to see whatever else I make in the future. And I can't forget all my wonderful Patreons over on goodoldpatreon.com. Thank you to all of you. I'm sure some of you have been waiting for this for a long, long time, just going, hey, finish it up already. But yeah, it's done. Either way, until next time, bye-bye for now.